world.
Thanks, Derek, and thank you for sticking through to the end, everyone here. We've got a couple of great guests, and I'm going to focus on the transitions, what's coming. We've got two people here who have great experience in transitions, and then in just a little bit, I'll bring up Louise, who's the new director of the Office of Outdoor Recreation in the state of Colorado, and we'll add to the conversation in terms of how do states start to work on recreation. There's an old adage that if you are, a political adage, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And so when you're sitting in a transition time like this, you have to make a decision whether you're going to be at the table or whether you're going to be on the menu. And I think for many years, recreation has been on the menu. We've not been as effective as we could be in terms of setting agendas. I think we're getting much better. There's a lot of groups working very hard on setting early agendas, getting in with administrations. I think seeing Secretary Clinton's announcement yesterday on recreation showed that we're seeing some real progress in that area. So I want to congratulate everyone who's working on that front. But we have two campaigns going, and a lot of uncertainty coming into this political period. And more importantly, we have a massively changing recreation infrastructure in the United States. I don't think, personally, we're ready for the wave that's about to hit us. The urbanization that was discussed at the on the last panel is a huge trend. And it's going to fundamentally change how people perceive recreation. It's not our definition of recreation. It's where an urbanized, multicultural, postmodern Obama culture is going to define recreation. And we're in that business now. And I don't think we're ready. And so recreation and how people perceive recreation is not going to be Eisenhower era. And so transitions are going to matter right now, and our vision of the future is going to matter right now. So with that, I've got two very special guests with me who have been part of setting great agendas in the country. To my left, I have Mark Ray, who, for those of you who know, began his career working in the Bureau of Land Management in Billings, Montana, and then spent most of 20 years working in a number of national trade associations with a variety of staff and leadership capacities. And from 1995 to 2001, Mark was professional staff member of the U.S. Senate Committee on Energy and Natural Resources under Chairman Frank Murkowski. And in 2001, he was appointed by President Bush to serve as the Undersecretary for Natural Resources and Environment at the U.S. Department of Agriculture, where he served for more than 7 years. He currently teaches at Michigan State, and he works with public affairs practice of the Livingston Group. So welcome, Mark. Thank you for joining us. We also have Jim Lyons, and Jim currently serves as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Land and Minerals Management here in the U.S. Department of Interior, where he focuses on public lands, energy, forestry, landscape level conservation. He's also served with the Agriculture Department's Undersecretary of Natural Resource and Environment during the Clinton administration. So we've got yin and yang sitting next to me, which is a terrific opportunity for people who have really led this area of recreation policy in the Forest Service. So I welcome you both and thank you for being here. So I'm going to start. We've only got a little bit of time with the Honorable Mark Ray. He's got a 4:15, so we're going to make sure that we get a good, robust conversation, then bring up Luis in a second. Mark, help us understand, as we're going into this administrational change, we've got a lot of staff changes, we've got political appointees coming up. You've been involved in this type of transition before. What is the transition team thinking about right now? How should we be approaching those campaigns? What is the message? And if you had maybe 2 or 3 burning issues that you think the recreation industry is facing right now, what would you put on that list?
Okay. Happy to help. I have a hard stop at 4:15 because I'm actually kind of a last-minute fill-in anyway, and I've got to teach a class across town at 4:30. And if I don't get there on time, the students leave, as you might remember from your college years. So, you know, I think what you all probably want from Jim and I is a prediction of what's going to happen during this transition. And to paraphrase Yogi Berra, predictions are hard, particularly when they're about the future. So I'm probably not going to do that for you. What I'm going to do is look at how the past couple of transitions have worked, because I don't think the one that is upcoming will be functionally that much different. So the first piece of advice I'd give you is that if you're starting to worry about how you're going to interact with the transition process and the transition teams after Election Day, don't bother worrying, because you're already too late to have any material effect on what's going to happen. What you need to be doing now, as we emerge from the primary season and the two parties' nominees are becoming more clearly identified, is building your teams to work with each of the two campaigns at the time when they can begin to focus on discrete areas of public policy that are not necessarily first-tier areas of policy, and this isn't, in case you were confused about that, maybe lower second tier, maybe even top third tier. But you know, at some point during the general election campaign, the issue will be engaged, and by that point, you should have people working with the campaign, either as volunteers that are valued for their expertise, or maybe even paid professionals who are working the campaign that are getting the kinds of policy messages that you want into the process. Okay? If you succeed in that, then your role and a success in the subsequent transition is going to be much more likely than if you start to worry about what that role should be the day after Election Day, when the transition process will already be underway. Transitions used to be kind of chaotic and slapdash, historically at least. That's not the case anymore. Now there's a relatively standard structure to them. It starts with a bilateral organizing memorandum of understanding co-signed by whoever is the sitting White House Chief of Staff, which will most likely by November still be Dennis McDonough, and the chairman of the transition director of the incoming administration. If that's a Trump administration, that'll be Governor Chris Christie of New Jersey. If it's a Hillary Clinton administration, it will most likely, in my judgment, be John Podesta, who served in that role in both the Obama administration and probably in at least one of the two Clinton administrations, if my memory is correct. Then the transition organization will be provided a turnkey office by the General Services Administration. It'll be in a building on G Street, not very far from the White House, so that there can be a lot of back and forth communication. That office will have space, secure computer facilities, and will be, the day the transition team walks in the door, a fully functioning operation. The National Security Agency will arrange parallel security briefings. Transition teams for each department and agency will be named, cleared, and provided working space in the department and agencies that they're working in. Clearances are important because transition teams involve experts, only some of whom want to eventually work in the new administration, others of whom may be happy to serve the transition process, but don't have any intention of staying on. Liaisons will be established between the transition teams in each department and agency and the department and agency that they operate in. And you will find that hangers-on and freelancers and self-aggrandizers who will be out in force during this period will be shunted and discouraged to the extent possible. The transition teams basically have two objectives in the time that they're alive and operating. The first is to organize and ground the new administration by producing position papers on those issues that they think are important for the incoming administration to have, and by producing lists of potential nominees for both cabinet and sub-cabinet and various and sundry appointments within their jurisdiction. If you've been successful in being of service to the winning campaign, If you've been successful in being of service to the losing campaign, you've performed a valuable public service, but your role is over. But if you've been successful in being of service to the winning campaign, then it's reasonable to expect that some of your issues, some of your people may be selected to participate in the transition process, and that's how you'll have the largest amount of influence. During that transition period, from basically the middle of November to the middle of January, which isn't very long, you can expect that the people working in the transition teams will be working extraordinarily long days. They won't have time to meet with you during that period. Your interest in meeting with them to spend an hour or however long you think you need to tell them all the important things that you're about and need them to address will be largely rebuffed. So if you're hoping that you're going to have long and searching meetings during that 2-month period, you can pretty much forget that, unless you can trade on the charity and kindness of a couple of people who know you well enough to know that you'll be brokenhearted and suicidal if you don't get at least 15 minutes. But, you know, realistically, the amount of work that they have to do during that period of time reduces them to caucusing within their own organization to use existing available resources, some from the campaign and some from other places, to do the work that they need to do under very tight deadlines and working very long days. A meal is a luxury during that period of time for people on the transition team, not to discourage any of you from being transition team members, but if you are selected and you're a diabetic, make sure your insulin supply is up to date. During that period, each side strives for open and clear communications, given that there are political limitations, particularly if it's a transition between administrations of different parties, and legal limitations, because if these are private citizens serving as transition team members who are, for instance, representing clients in private practice in their day jobs, then there has to be some restriction on what they can see if indeed the material that they're being asked to review affects the well-being of the clients that they're otherwise serving, and there are largely security limitations as well. What both sides strive for in a well-executed transition is open communications to allow that transition to occur as seamlessly as possible, so that for the outside world, it is clear that there's only one government in place at any point in time, both before and after the incoming president takes the oath of office and lowers his right hand. Because to have any confusion in that regard raises the prospect that our national security can be jeopardized. So that's sort of how it works in a very brief nutshell. If I was going to be talking about the main issues that you ought to be trying to engage the campaigns on, there would only be one, really, and that is how to make recreation a good federal investment of appropriated dollars in a high-deficit environment where very difficult decisions are going to be made, whoever the next president is.
Thank you. So, Jim, if you could add to what Mark has just gone over, is there any difference between a Democratic or Republican administration that you've experienced based on what you just heard from Mark? And when you think of it, let's maybe hone it a little closer. When you look at a 100-day agenda that's being prepared by any administration, what type of agenda items would make that list, from your opinion?
Sure.
And for example, and maybe give us one specifically from the recreation agenda side that would be an example either that you've used in the past or might be something that we should be thinking about going forward.
All right, Frank. I'm glad to do that. I think Mark's done a great job of describing the process of transition, so I want to focus on the first point he made. Because most critical is that if you want to have any influence over an administration agenda, you have to engage now. And as evidenced by the op-ed that Frank alluded to that ran in California from Mrs. Clinton, a lot of thinking is already going on about the role that her administration would play. The focus of this op-ed was on national parks, public lands, and conservation. And it also addressed recreation in that context. So those conversations are being had. Policy teams are formed. And I mean, no surprise for Mrs. Clinton, being the policy wonk that she is, that she's already got a notebook full of policy ideas, concerns, interests, issues. That's just the person that she is. So, so that early engagement is really critical. And I think as a part of that, what helps build kind of the case for recreation is to build it in the context of current issues and concerns. And probably the strongest one, and the one that is constantly focused on in polling, is the economy. So I think building the case for recreation as an engine in the economy, as the catalyst for economic development, as evidenced by the President's visit yesterday to Elkhart, make the case for how recreation is going to contribute to addressing the larger political issues of the day and the concerns that most Americans have. Now, there's certainly other issues that come into play for recreation. Public health would be one. That's, we within the recreation community have tried to emphasize time and time again, and I think it's getting more and more attention, and there's value in bringing that, that issue to the fore as well. Another to consider is the continuing concern about infrastructure across the United States, and the failure of the Congress to adequately fund or invest in the need to improve, in particular, the gray infrastructure. But here I'm going to recommend to consider both the gray and the green infrastructure. You know, the gray infrastructure, you know, roads, utilities, et cetera, are in desperate need, and you can go online, or you can virtually once a week at least hear a story about the crumbling infrastructure. Well, recreation would benefit tremendously from that. Depends heavily on infrastructure. So I think building the case for why infrastructure would benefit recreation and provide the benefits that recreation can provide from an economic standpoint, from a public health standpoint, from a kind of good environment and exposure to the outdoors standpoint is going to be important. But I think also interesting is the interest in green infrastructure. We've seen that concept evolve. And I think the catalyst for an expanded recreation portfolio within the administration and expanded recreation opportunities are going to be those investments as well. So it's trails, it's habitat restoration, watershed restoration, it's waterways. You look at the impacts of drought in the West on water-based recreation, and clearly there's a need to deal with that infrastructure if we're to continue to have the kind of access to lakes and rivers and the like that we would like to see, and that drive a big part of the recreation economy. So building the case in the context of what is current and of immediate political concern is going to be, I think, critically important. I think the other thing I would suggest in the current time frame is to bring hard evidence and case studies to the fore and use those to make the argument for why recreation should be a part of the new administration's focus, should be part of the 100 days agenda, so to speak, and think about where you want to target that effort. So another important thing to do right now is build relationships, expand your network, identify people who will be engaged, and that can be members of Congress or their staffs, or it can be recreation industry leaders, for sure. But building that network is going to be important because you want to hope that you get one or two people who represent your interests on the transition team. And again, most of the agenda may be set, but they can play a critical role, as Mark suggested, in helping to identify potential appointees and influencing the thinking that goes into preparing the issue papers or the recommendations to the various secretaries that will be served by the different transition teams. I served on the USDA transition team in 1992, and then ultimately ended up becoming Undersecretary for Natural Resources and Environment, just to set a high water mark so Mark had something to try to achieve when he got that job. but very important to build those networks and connections. And if you can't get somebody on the team from the immediate recreation community to identify potential advocates who will carry your message into those discussions, carry your message into the debate about priorities. And at that point in the transition team, I think Mark would agree, then you're into specific departments. And so what is USDA going to do with the Forest Service? What's going to be the recreation agenda there? What would the Secretary of the Interior do? Hopefully, what would Commerce start to think about in terms of the contributions they can make? And the same would be true there, not just in a general sense, the economy, but also with NOAA and NIMS and the potential to build opportunities there, whether it's related to fisheries or water resources and the like. So I think in the near term, to build that 100-day agenda, it requires engagement now in discussions as part of the policy teams. It's easier to get on a policy team than it is a transition team, but that's one way to transition to that role on the transition team, so to speak. But engage. Don't sit back and wait for the election. And don't sit back and wait for others to carry your message, but find ways to connect the dots and build the coalition of interests, just as you would build a coalition of interests to try to get legislation passed. Well, you're trying to build coalitions of interests who can help ensure that the new administration sees this as a priority. And in order for that to be a priority, it's got to be politically important. And to get back to where I started, that means it's probably got to have something to do with helping to enhance the economy or public health or address other pressing public issues like infrastructure.
Thank you, Jim. Well, since we've been talking about future political appointees, I think maybe this is a good time to bring up Luis Benitez. Come on up, Luis. Join the conversation. And for those who don't know, a couple of years ago, Utah, and I had the great pleasure of being involved in this, formed the first Office of Outdoor Recreation. Luis has just been appointed very recently the director of the Office of Outdoor Recreation in the governor's office in Colorado, the state of Colorado. This is important because this is about economic drivers. As we've had a greater and greater conversation about the economic impact of recreation in the country, you now have opportunities in governor's offices and states starting to recognize that there needs to be somebody on point to be coordinating these efforts to really drive that economic gain, see the jobs. We're missing that coordination at the federal level. I think there's an opportunity, and we'll get to that maybe in a question in a moment. But I wanted to really talk about kind of the czar concept, which is really what you've stepped into right now, Louise, and thank you for joining us. And what have you learned now coming in these first months in terms of the challenges, the benefits of having that coordination, someone focused on recreation? Where are you seeing the benefits? Where maybe you're seeing some of the challenges, and are there some lessons that we can bring into these transition conversations that we're going to have with future administrations?
Thanks, Frank, and thanks everybody for sticking around. I think the people left in the room could identify as true believers at this point, so hopefully this is a productive conversation. You know, Mark and Jim, you brought up some really interesting points, ones that I want to touch on kind of at a state level, because if anybody heard my comments yesterday, truly I think that this office represents a bipartisan initiative. This is something that it doesn't matter what side of the fence you're on or what party will take power, chances are everybody recreates in their own way, whatever that modality of recreation is. So I think that's ultimately a focus point, and frankly, one of the reasons why I have a job. I think when you start to talk about consumer spending, when you start to talk about tax base, actual real jobs in a state, more and more the outdoor industry is less about hugging a tree or saving a river or conserving a trail. And when you're talking about a rural footprint, it really is about that. It's about job creation and sustainability of an economy. So I think there's a couple of important things to think about at this point. You know, it's interesting under the auspice of transition to think about, you know, the short, finite time you have to address some of these issues. And I used to say this all the time as an Outward Bound instructor to my students as we were letting them go on their journeys in the backcountry. If your only job was to put yourself out of a job, what would you do? How would you train the people around you? What skills would you impart? How would you inspire what comes next? Because, you know, mortgages happen, families happen, responsibilities happen. So that idea of putting yourself out of a job is scary, yet, you know, to Frank's point, this is where we are right now as an industry. We have to figure out what comes next. So regardless of the party that is in power, it would be lunacy to look at the outdoor industry and say, that's not important. We don't need to focus on it. We don't need to provide funding for these things. It needs to be seen as a sustainable portion of our GDP. So to that point, and I'm sure Frank is going to get to this in a minute, there are 2 bills on the floor of the House right now, which I'm sure and I hope all of you are aware of. The REC Act, which is moving towards counting all revenue and all jobs towards the GDP. And the hypothesis is if we actually do that and are counted as a segment, that we could be worth 3 to 6% of the GDP. So that's less about people saying, you're not worth that much, you're the seasonal fun kids, and much more about saying, wow, you're actually a part of our economy. What can we do to make you sustainable because we're attached to health and wellness, because we're attached to the great outdoors? All of these things, I think, are coming to this crucial pivot point. And then the second bill that's out there right now is the Recreation Not Red Tape bill, which hopefully all of you are aware of as well, which is moving to cut some of the red tape around getting organizations and people access to some of those resources. So not only, again, as the individual recreationist, but also as an organization, as a company, as a nonprofit, to be able to utilize those resources to drive economic development. So for us in the state, the reason why I put this picture up here is kind of a fun cartoon. We were working with this cartoonist in Colorado during one of my first strategy sessions, and she asked a very simple question. Talk about all the things that the outdoor industry sort of does in your state and holds up. And my advisory council at the time was in the room. We started throwing all this stuff at her, and you know, her pen could barely keep up. And the realization that all of these different modalities touch a lot of our economy in all these different parts. You know, when we started to look at this thing, there was this deep awareness of the fact that this isn't just Colorado. This is states that have a significant portion of an outdoor industry and an outdoor economy, which tied together has the ability to raise all boats. So the 4 key areas of focus for my office and for Colorado, and I hope for other states as well, economic development is obviously really important. Creating those jobs, bringing those businesses and organizations to town to make that section of the economy more robust. Conservation and stewardship is also incredibly important. You have to take care of the resource that drives the economic engine. That's incredibly important to us in the state. That leads to education and workforce training. So I want to go a little bit deeper with this because I think this is important from a manufacturing and jobs overseas perspective. There's this big move in Colorado, along with other states, to start talking about kind of like the craft brewing and distilling industry, the craft small batch manufacturing movement. So I'll give you an example. There's a company called Vormy out of Pagosa Springs, small little town in Colorado. They make what I like to say is the most expensive hoodie on the planet. Does anybody know this company? Where the waterproofing agent is literally molecularly bound to the fabric. So you could wear this hoodie watching TV and eating potato chips off your belly, going skiing in the rain, fly fishing, whatever it is that you do. It's incredible. Now the CEO of Vormy, who came from Microsoft, has said out loud, you know, a lot of our orders have to be done overseas, but we really want to bring this trade back to the United States. We want to do small batch manufacturing here in Colorado. Where is there a cut and sew facility that could actually facilitate this process? Started looking around, and there's this organization in Rifle, Colorado, another small town, called The Whole Works, that raised their hand and said, you know what, we have this small cut and sew facility staffed with, frankly, seasonal river guides, ski guides, folks in the outdoor industry learning a trade. Will help you do some of this small batch manufacturing. So through that process, the local community college, Colorado Mountain College, I say small, but they have 11 campuses and they serve 30,000 students, said, you know what, there might actually be something to this. Perhaps we could put together an associate's level degree, a trade-based degree, to redefine what trade is defined by in the United States, focused on cut and sew. So they're in the middle of that curriculum review process right now to establish that and offer that to folks that work at the whole works. So you have the job, you have a resume filled with working for hopefully iconic brands across the United States, and then you have the education. So it completes the ecosystem. So we're focusing on everything from that to one of my personal pet projects, looking at an executive MBA just for the outdoor industry. Because when I talk to industry leaders across the country, and Frank, I know you can weigh in on this, they talk a lot about you follow the passion point first in our industry, you find your job, and then you hack your education second. Oftentimes the education is organic. People find it through figuring their own way through. What if there was actually an MBA focused on what's most important to the outdoor industry? Usually when I say that out loud, there are usually people in the room that go, wow, where is it? Where can I sign up? And how much is it going to cost? So we're really looking at that, which ultimately I believe leads to the fourth tenet, which is industry innovations. When you really start to think about what's next in our industry and how we're going to capture some of that, e-bikes, battery-powered, full suspension mountain bikes, road bikes. I was just talking to the AMA about this electric motorcycle that's been entered into the Pikes Peak uphill race this year. It's sort of changing the game. The mountain biking community doesn't want to claim e-bikes, nor does the motorized community because they're not sure how it's going to evolve. Here's an emerging market that there's no one entity standing up and saying, we'll take the manufacturing, we'll educate your leadership, we'll figure out how all that works. So I think that's something important to focus on. And then when you start to think about the diversification that will drive that process, Latino Outdoors, Children in Nature, all the organizations that we've heard of and from over the past couple of days, this ecosystem and how to connect some of those dots, I really think can be representative in other states having a similar role like mine.
Thank you, Luis. Really appreciate that. We're going to continue the conversation. I know that you have to move on. You got time for one more. That's great. I appreciate that, Mark. Because here's the question that I have right now, and I think that I'd really appreciate before you head out. When you think about how recreation is changing, I'm going to go right to urbanization because I think this is a huge issue for the recreation community. And for infrastructure, I think, Jim, what you were talking about earlier, we're now moving towards consumers having an Amazon and Google expectation, one touch, convenience, access all the time now. And with that comes a comfort in an urban environment, which also means more developed recreation, more destination camping, more urbanized outdoor recreation trends. We're seeing this as a trend. We're seeing it in the numbers. We're seeing it in the sales. This is real and it's coming. That really fundamentally changes agency priorities, agency funding, and that's been a challenge, and you brought that up as the key issue going forward. How can the recreation industry come to a new administration and really change the dynamic of the funding so that we're driving investments towards where there's going to be the real economic development?
I think by partnering with the private sector. I think most of the new developments in recreation are going to generate markets that the private sector will fill. And I think the role for the federal agencies is to preserve the opportunity for other more traditional forms of recreation, and then to partner with the private sector to begin to introduce the broad body politic to those opportunities as they exist. And you ought to look at recreation as a segmented industry, the same way the auto industry looks at autos, right? They project that at a certain point in a person's life they're going to buy one model, and they design their program to use the way a person's life changes to introduce them to other models that are more relevant to what they're doing at different parts of their life. So you don't have 16-year-olds buying economy vans, but you might have a 16-year-old who had his first car was an inexpensive Chevy that stays with Chevy at the point where, as he matures, he needs an economy van for family purposes, is introduced to that. And I think that's one of the opportunities for the recreation industry, is to segment the industry and look at the fact that the federal government can offer some recreation opportunities that aren't as market-driven as the private sector can, but that are going to still be relevant at person's life at some stage, that they ought to take advantage of. And having been introduced to it during the time that they were interested in whatever the new and sexy recreation opportunity is today. So with that, I'm going to leave you all. Thanks very much.
Let's say. Jim, you had something to add to that. I'd love to hear your answer to that question, particularly since we're seeing such a strong shift in consumer behavior, consumer expectation.
So I want Mark to get off the stage before I disagree with him, so. No. Actually, contrary to popular belief, Mark and I agree more than we disagree on many things. The only part I disagree with, I agree that the private sector should be and will be the catalyst for this change, but I think we have to think about the role that government then plays in that context. And, you know, I'll start in rural landscapes, Forest Service, BLM. We manage landscapes. So we play a critical role in trying to develop the infrastructure that facilitates the use of these new tools. And you know, whether it's an electric bike or whether it's some other form of outdoor recreation, I don't think the agencies that I've been associated with, so that's Forest Service, NRCS, Natural Resources Conservation Service, and the Bureau of Land Management, really think about recreation as a primary use yet, although we're getting there. That has to shift, and that shifts as we see the economic growth and the opportunities to go there. But let me shift to the urban focus, because there's you know, the growth in urban areas and the interest in recreation. I think we have to think about what role city governments can play in building that recreation infrastructure. And there, I'd suggest, Frank, that what we need to think about is, you know, just like my phone that has multiple functions, we need to think about trails as serving multiple functions. So there are transportation routes to work. There are recreation opportunities within the city. There are ways to connect communities. There are also ways to connect, if we start to think a little smarter about how we look at a larger landscape and build the infrastructure. There are also access to places outside of the city. And believe it or not, DC does have some outstanding recreation opportunities nearby, but usually you have to get in a car to get there. But if the infrastructure were built so that we could enhance that access, then those trails serve multiple functions, just like my phone. And it's an appropriate role for government to play. The private sector comes up with the innovation, creates the technology. We can provide the access and the resources that support those recreation opportunities.
Thank you, Jim. Let's talk, how much conversation has there been at the state level as to the change of recreation activities and how policy has to change, Louise? And I'll give you one example. I had just recently, I was with a RV CEO who said in 5 to 7 years, you'll have automated RVs, self-driving RVs. So how is the public land ready? Federal, state? What are the implications, the policy implications? Obviously, that's huge. I've heard within 5 years, you'll have the trucking industry be starting to be automated. So these are big, big shifts that technology are going to hit. Again, we're in a Eisenhower infrastructure component with a boomer mindset moving to a fundamental shift. How do we get ready? What are those conversations? Are they happening? How do we start them? And particularly with new administrations, whether it's at the state or the federal. And I'll let you each answer this question. I'll start with you, Louise.
That's great. Thanks, Frank. So anybody see the video clip of the guy asleep in the auto-driving Tesla in stop-and-go traffic in LA? Has anybody seen that? Oh, it's hysterical. The guy's literally tongue hanging out, drool on the shirt, asleep at the wheel as the car bounces him down traffic. So I do agree that, you know, we're getting to that space of automation and that space of changing the paradigm of how we interact. I had this great conversation with a 17-year-old the other day who is early admittance to MIT, so I would argue that he knows a thing or two about what's going on in the technology space. And he said, as he held up his phone, he said, if I have to touch this thing 3 times, you've lost me. That was horrifying to me. I'm like, wait a minute, if I tap it, yes, if you're trying to tell me something via a platform, a mobile platform, and if I have to touch my screen 3 times, by the 3rd time, I am 90% out the door, and I have studies to prove it, which it completely shifts the mindset from a policy perspective. And Frank, getting back to your original comment of being in sort of this Amazon, Google, instant gratification, you know, how will we best serve the things that are most important to us? You know, I think ultimately it's going to take a change in awareness around policy and the ability to be nimble. So I'll give you an example that I'm sure most of you have heard of. Anybody heard of the app called HipCamp? I see a couple of head bobbles. Some people, oh, look, ironically enough, some of the young folks in the back are raising their hands. So it's a website to help make a campsite reservation. And basically the CEO, Alyssa, was just tired of using one of the old reservation systems that we have in existence, that you have to expand it, contract it, shift it over on a mobile platform. You can't really find what you're looking for. So for her, it was just time to build a better banana. You're going to see that innovation out there, and it will go around processes that we cannot be nimble and change. Now, to Mark's comment about public-private partnership, I think that's ultimately where the sweet spot can exist. I think if we can embrace some of those thought leaders and really bring that in from an advisory council perspective, you know, one of the things that I think about with those 2 bills that I mentioned, if they actually pass, we're going to have a higher level of representation in DC for our industry. Because people are going to be here asking questions, I would assume, Jim. Hey, what's going on with you with innovation? Hey, who's leading this space for this, this, and this? Who do we talk to? Who do we contact? So we're going to have to build that construct. We're going to have to build the plane literally while we're flying it. And so I think we have to be ready for that. So, you know, one of Governor Hickenlooper's initiatives in Colorado is, and it's a call to action, to have a citizen be within 10 minutes of green space, regardless of where they live. Now, from an infrastructure standpoint, there's a lot of people in Denver whose heads are spinning. Okay, well, is it a trail? Is it a sidewalk? Is it a bike lane? How do we do that? What does that look like? But he's really trying to challenge us to think a little bit bigger from an infrastructure perspective, which leads to policy changes, which leads to innovation. So I think it's that trickle-down effect that we're going to be looking at with regards to engagement at the state level, and I think that level of engagement will hopefully drive a deeper construct at the federal level to ultimately result in being a little bit more nimble.
So I'll offer this observation. I think, and we've seen this over the past decade or so, innovation more often than not is occurring at the state level. States are more nimble. I think they're closer to the ground. They're kind of responding to constituencies in ways that the federal government heretofore has not been able to do. I have a lot of theories about why that is. You know, cuts in federal funding, cuts in workforce, an aging workforce. I mean, I dare say the agencies I work with or worked for, most of their leadership are at or beyond retirement age. And the challenge is attracting young people who are innovative as opposed to Luddites, who want to be a part of something new. So, and I don't know what the fix for that is. I would say, though, that this is another place where the recreation community and the industries associated with it can play an important role. I mean, bringing the community together, wise people like these guys, and even you, Derek, and have a conversation about what kind of innovation, changes in technology, changes in infrastructure are going to be essential to prepare for the rapidly changing notions of recreation and use. And I frankly, I don't see it happening. You know, it happened early in the administration. The Obama administration brought in some very innovative people. You know, they have a chief technology officer, for example, young women from Google and others, and I think they started to make things happen. But the agencies are still stuck in what they traditionally do and always have had to do. And so the opportunities for innovation don't occur. So now's another important time to start having those conversations. I mean, bring folks together from the recreation industry, people like yourself, and, you know, let's spend 3 or 4 days and have a conversation about what does this administration, whatever party it's from, need to do to set the stage, because they can't make the changes all at once, but set the stage to advance how we manage these assets and resources to be prepared for these rapidly changing technologies. I guess the other thing I would suggest, you know, in that regard, is that there's a need to rethink how government is structured, and I know that's scary because trying to reorganize government is generally a zero-sum game from a political standpoint, and it has to do with the ownership of committees and jurisdiction, and no one wants to give anything up. But, you know, we used to have a Bureau of Outdoor Recreation, which disappeared many, many years ago. Well, we're talking about, you know, a potential sector of the economy that's generating 3 to 5% of the GDP, that clearly is demonstrating its economic impact and influence. You know, maybe it's time in a new administration to think of a structure that will give more attention and more focus to that. I would suggest it needs to be able to work across agencies, because many agencies provide recreation opportunities. And we are trying to do things in this administration to try and foster that kind of collaboration and coordination as opposed to the traditional stovepipe way of doing business. And it should involve the states right from the outset. So a partnership exists that can be thinking ahead to how to kind of restructure what we do. And I'll just offer this to close this comment. You know, when I started my career, timber drove the Forest Service. The measure of performance was getting the cutout. And then some changes occurred, some of which I had something to do with, but changes occurred in the Forest Service. And now, you know, well, some may debate if the Forest Service knows where it's headed. I've heard that. You know, there's a much stronger focus on watersheds and watershed health. There's a much stronger focus on recreation and recreation opportunities. You know, out of concern and obvious impacts, there's a much bigger focus on fire. And unfortunately, it drives the agency's budget, and that needs to be fixed. But the point I'm trying to make is, so in my relatively short career, we've seen a rapid transition, and the pace of change is just accelerating. So bringing people together to have these conversations now, and maybe it's actually just teeing up what we need to have in place by 2020, I think it would be a very, very useful investment, and it would certainly get the attention of the wiser people on transition teams who will involve people interested in technology. I hope younger, innovative people who are out there, you know, kind of creating these opportunities and capitalizing on the new energy and initiative that's there.
Yeah, it brings me to one of my, you know, I think, Jim, you brought up the interagency coordination, and again, we're seeing that now at the state level and the nimbleness that's occurring, and I'm excited to see that. I think that the challenge has been, and I think the Obama administration has done a very good job at doing the coordination, particularly early on with America's Great Outdoors. You started to see agencies working together in a way that we had not seen previously. Obviously, the Federal Council on Recreation is trying to continue to lead that charge, but it's underfunded. It doesn't have the mandate it needs to within the agencies. We need to change that debate. And I think it's an important one regarding whether we pass the REC Act. I think being recognized as a sector is the starting point, because we're in the quality of life. We're sort of in the founding documents. Do you realize pursuit of happiness business? That's recreation. So we're that critical to the industry and to the country. But we're looked at as a nice to have, not a must have. We're often looked at as the industry that it's what you do with leftover time, water, and land, and it's just not true. We're so critical to the country in that regard. That coordination piece, do we need to have a White House coordinator on this to be able to drive the innovation, to drive those discussions, to get us out of agency soup? Because if you're a business, and I've been working with the business community now for 20-something years on the Hill, you're dealing with commerce if you're on one issue. You're dealing with Department of Defense if you're on another. You're dealing with ag. You're dealing with DOI. Then you go through the agency soup going down. If you were in a company, you would have pulled all of those together and had it in one office, and it'd be focused on recreation. Now, obviously, there's other stakeholders, other sectors that have a dog in the hunt that have historically really been driving the agenda, but we're seeing that agenda be balanced and shifted. Do we need that coordination at that high level? What do you say from the federal and experience side, Jim, and what do you say from the state side, Louise, having just stepped into it?
Well, I mean, I'd ask Louise, so where are you housed in state government, and how does that function?
Yeah, I think, thanks, Jim. I think it's one of those things that I focused on straight out of the gate, and I think it's a replicable and repeatable model. So I was intentionally housed in the Office of Economic Development and International Trade. And the reason why that was intentional was to highlight the fact that we are a segment of the economy. In Colorado, we're over $34 billion in consumer spending, with a B. So that's a significant portion. And the organic story is, well, isn't that all skiing? Skiing's only $4 billion of that $34 billion. So there's a lot of other things that go on. That's the reason why I was housed in OEDIT. As soon as I hit the ground and went on a listening tour, immediately put together an advisory council of C-suite level folks in the state, representative less about region, much more about function. So having someone from the OHV community, ski community, mountaineering, fishing, hunting, you name it, whatever the modality was, putting together an advisory council. Then underneath that advisory council, we put together regional outdoor recreation coalitions. So ultimately, those are the folks on the ground in a region. So when I say Mesa County, that's, if you're familiar with the Western Slope, Grand Junction, Fruita, Palisade. These are bike shop owners. These are river raft outfitters, hunting outfitters, horsepacking outfitters, a collection of for-profits and nonprofits, land agency representatives. Part of my advisory council is a senior representative that was just honored here with the Legends Award, Jim Bedwell. Brian St. George from the BLM, also a representative on my advisory council. So through that coalition, we get together, and the hope is that we're going to bring together the advisory councils and the regional coalitions to have a yearly leadership summit. So Colorado Outdoor Industry Leadership Summit, or COILS for short. Kind of snappy, huh? And then at that summit, we aren't going to talk about the reactive stuff, because everybody in that room does reactive really well. That's the day-to-day job that they hold. We're going to talk about the proactive stuff. What do we want in 5 years? What do we want in 10 years? What do we want the industry to look like in our state? And I strongly believe that that is a replicable and repeatable model at the federal level if done correctly.
So I guess my response to your question, Frank, is kind of twofold. First of all, I think what Louise described is the kind of structure that would be more productive and create more innovation, and I think that would be most helpful. I don't know if the czar model worked very well in the White House. It certainly got a lot of political heat. But and this is kind of inside baseball, but I think it's more a function of how the White House elects to function. The Clinton administration had a very, very strong CEQ. And it was the convener, the facilitator, the junkyard dog of policy when it came to the environment. If the Clinton administration were to win, and I can only relate to that because I've worked with John Podesta and I've worked with people like that, you might see a reconstituted CEQ that would play a role like that. But I think another thing to think about is, there are organizations within the White House that have a great deal of influence on policy, OMB, Council of Economic Advisors, and others. I think what's important is to make sure the people that understand the recreation economy and what we're talking about on the Council of Economic Advisors in a lead role in the Office of Management and Budget, where they can bring their expertise and experience to it. And typically what happens is, these advisors are Harvard, Yale, Princeton type graduates, who have, PhDs or strong backgrounds in economics, but not necessarily a sector. So they don't necessarily bring that expertise to the table. And they do what economists do, which scares me. But But I think bringing that expertise in is another way to make that happen. I think these are the kinds of ideas that need to be plugged into the conversations that the policy teams for both, for both camps, sorry, Bernie, both camps, need to think about as they start to think about how they want to structure transition, how they want to think about this. Because it would kill me to go, to see a new administration come in and not break some eggs in terms of restructuring, innovating, thinking about new approaches. And I think thinking, as you pointed out, Louise, prospectively. Let's not think about just what has to happen in the first 100 days. Let's think about what has to be in place in 2020 so as to be effective. And obviously progress towards that is going to be an important measure of the success of the administration, whether or not it's going to be reelected. But a smart administration will build that ramp-up capacity all the time, trying to paint a picture of the vision that they're trying to achieve. And obviously it's not just for recreation, it'll be in all sectors. But I think, we're having this conversation because recreation is becoming a more and more important part of the economy. You heard Secretary Jewell speak, some of you may have, or seen her remarks at National Geographic now a month or so ago, which she highlighted both the fact that commerce is now going to gather information about recreation values. She talked about future generations, her initiative with regard to youth in the outdoors, but really argued that 21st century conservation needs to look different than 20th century conservation. And to me, that's the exciting part of new policy direction, transition teams, and what a new administration, if it's wise, will think about as it moves forward.
So we're going to get to a wrap up and some final thoughts here. I guess recreation of the future is really what we're talking about. It's fundamentally changing. And I think it's so important for anyone who is in the room or on the webcast to understand that we don't have that vision clear, and it's time for the recreation industry and the recreation community to define that. For many, many years, we've defined it in a construct that has worked, and we've grown and gotten powerful. It is fundamentally changing, and I think it's important for us to really define what that is. It means bringing in innovative thinkers. It's bringing in new communities. It's uncommon partnerships, I think, are going to be the norm in the future. To that end, one of the things that we've been doing in the Recreation Trade Association universe, and my friend Glenn Hughes is here from ASA, we're pulling together the leading trade groups to put forth the business agenda for recreation. What's really going to drive the business agenda going forward? We're the ones doing the majority of the consumer research. We're the ones making the investments in the product and the innovations. We have that direct touch with the retailers. I bring this up because your definition of recreation is a biased one. I can guarantee it. I know at the Outdoor Retailer Show, I remember we went and said, who gets to go in the Outdoor Retailer Show at the time? And if we had defined the industry in the way we viewed it at that time and didn't open it up, and there were people advocating to, it's only this universe, you wouldn't have seen yoga end up in that trade show. You wouldn't have seen stand-up paddling in that trade show. So innovation would have been stopped. We're at a point right now where the consumer is going to define the future, and we have to align with it, and we need to be setting an agenda that's very consumer-centric, consumer-responsive. And that's really, I think, the major shift that the agencies have to get in. They're in the experience business now, and we have to help the agencies really meet that future. They're in the conservation business, and they've been in that, but it's now also in the experience business, and it's so important to realize there's a difference. So with that, I'll let both Louise and Jim wrap up. Louise, why don't you start, and then we'll finish with the Honorable Mr. Lyons.
Thanks, Frank. So to talk about the future, I'm going to go back, being a student of history, and I think it's important because you don't learn from it unless you capitalize off of it. So way back in 1910, and I know many people in the room have heard this before, Gifford Pinchot. Anybody know what I'm going to say? Conservation needs to be the greatest good to the largest amount of people for the longest time. Now, President Roosevelt, was a student of Mr. Pinchot, believed in everything that he wrote. Now, as a conservationist, sure, he hung out with John Muir for days in Yosemite Valley, figured out how to protect Yellowstone. But he was also a big game hunter. For him, it was about understanding what the marketplace was going to look like ultimately for tourism, how to highlight what's special to us, both as a country and as an industry, and to protect what matters most. The greatest good to the largest amount of people for the longest time. Ultimately, in my estimation, when you think about the future and you think about transition, that has to be the cornerstone of the conversation.
That was great. So I'll make 3 points in this regard, and I'll go back to where I started, not 1910, thank God. To me, what's critical is that we think about recreation and we kind of cast our future in terms of its contribution to the economy, its ability to generate employment, and also create revenue. Because government income is shrinking. The basis for revenue for many county and state economies are things like oil and gas, traditional energy resources. And since those governments are so dependent upon those resources, they hold dearly to anything and everything that's going to keep producing oil and gas as opposed to producing things like recreation. And you see that, I think, time and time again. Related to that, some may or may not know, but this is the 40th anniversary this fall of the passage of the National Forest Management Act and the Federal Land Policy Management Act. So those are the organic statutes, if you will, for the Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management. I would suggest that although those two statutes are built on the foundation of managing for multiple use and sustained yield, and the greatest good for the greatest number, we're just now starting to think about multiple use. And I can see that, I mean, I saw it in the Forest Service when I was involved in the transition there, and I think BLM is getting there as well. And so there's an opportunity here to kind of work off of that foundation of an anniversary to start to make the case for managing these landscapes to benefit all these various uses, and recreation as an important component is one of those uses that needs to be focused on. Third thing I'll say is that I think we need to think about conservation differently. So when I grew up, or when I was in graduate school, I used to follow the, maybe I won't, there we go, the traditional Gifford Pinchot definition, which was kind of wise use. But the definition of conservation has evolved, and now more and more conservation is associated with what I refer to and is drawing lines on maps and setting areas aside. And that's an important component. I consider that protection. It's an important component of a spectrum of different approaches to conservation. To me, conservation is still wise use, but it's protect those areas that are inviolate and really need to be protected. Wisely manage those resources that can be used for multiple purposes, and that means more focus on trails and recreation and water resources and other things, as well as, you know, those are the working lands, so producing goods and services generally. And then the third component, I think, is, you know, the places that are pretty well managed almost to death in some places, and if they can still produce resources, keep producing them. So we're limiting the impacts we have on an ever-shrinking western landscape. And that affords us more flexibility to use those working lands for these other uses. You know, recreation being, I think, one of the paramount ones, because it provides, you know, a benefit to the economy, it generates employment. And if we're innovative about this, it'll produce more and more revenue, although we have to think about ways to capture that revenue. You know, I think that's important. Last point I'll make is, and I've been through this now 35 years, so almost older than you, Frank. It's scary. And I've been involved in change in a number of incarnations of my life. Change is really hard. People hate change. People hate you when you try to force change. So I would encourage you to not think about change, but I would encourage you to do as Frank just suggested. Let's think of a vision of the future Let's not think about change. Let's think about innovation and ways to capitalize on innovation to achieve a vision that hopefully we can all share and invest in. People, particularly given the economy in some rural areas, are deathly afraid of change, and they're holding on to what they have now. But the future is what Louise is talking about. And we need to somehow get those communities to share in the excitement of that future and to engage in the innovation, whether it's small batch manufacturing, I like that concept, or other approaches. They need to think about driverless vehicles, and they need to think about different ways in which we're going to use these landscapes. And I think if we're driven by innovation, based on a vision of what the future can be, I think then the sky's the limit. And I think, particularly for recreation, it may finally be, our coming to get out there and capitalize on that, because the way we're managing these landscapes now is going to decline. It's going to have detrimental impacts on limited resources. It's not generating the revenue that counties and communities desperately need. And if we can offer something else that also provides for conservation, as I defined it, of those landscapes, less impactful, wiser use, I think that can be sustainable. And that's what I encourage us to think about. But I would definitely encourage this community to engage now in thinking about that future and in finding people who can communicate that to people who are involved in the different campaigns, as well as find advocates who either, if they're not part of the transition or candidates for a position in a new administration, are going to be advocates for this kind of creativity and innovation that's really going to drive us forward.
Great comments, Jim. Louise, thank you so much. I'm going to just end with just one reminder that if you're not disrupting your own business model, someone else will do it for you. We're in that world, and the world is coming towards us. They're expecting recreation to be there. They want recreation to be there. We're critically important to them. I am so bullish on our future, but I do think that we have to evolve. And as long as we do, we've got a long and very bright future. I'd like to thank also our departed guest and our entire panel. So let's thank them, and then Derek, bring it home.